All right, today we're jumping into a really short but honestly super fascinating ancient record, the Book of Jarom. At its heart, it's a story of survival against some pretty crazy odds, and it all boils down to one powerful idea that basically shaped an entire civilization. So let's start with the author himself. Right out of the gate, you can just feel the weight on his shoulders. He's been tasked with continuing the history of his people, but he's kind of like, what's left to say? My ancestors wrote it all. This quote, it just sets this incredible tone of reluctance mixed with a deep sense of duty. So who was this scribe with such a heavy burden? Well, Jarom was commanded by his father, Enos, to keep this sacred record going. But this wasn't like writing in a diary. He was working under a very specific and very challenging constraint. Okay, so here's the twist. The entire record was being inscribed on what they called the small plates. What does that mean? It means space was a huge issue. He couldn't just write down everything that happened. He had to be incredibly picky, focusing only on the stuff that was absolutely vital for future generations. And, get this, that included for a rival group, the Lamanites. Every good story needs a conflict, right? Well, Jarom's people, the Nephites, they were dealing with two massive ones. They were basically being squeezed from the inside by their own flaws and from the outside by a really powerful enemy. Let's break that down. So the first problem was an inside job. Jarom says a lot of his people were just spiritually stubborn, hardness of their hearts, stiffness of their necks. But, and this is important, he's very careful to point out that not everyone was like this. There were still good, faithful people around, and that ends up being a really crucial detail. And then there was the threat from the outside, which was constant. Existential. The Lamanites, who were related to them but totally hostile, were, and I quote, exceeding more numerous. So they were always under attack. It's a classic David versus Goliath situation. And we're not talking about a single battle here. After 200 years, the Nephites had actually gotten really strong. By the time Jarom finishes up his part of the record, almost 238 years have gone by. This is a story about long-term, generational survival. So, this all brings us to the core of the whole book. How did they do it? How did this smaller group, with all its own internal problems, manage to hold out for so long against a much bigger enemy? Well, Jarom says there was a specific formula, a kind of divine cause and effect. Let's really zero in on this question, because it's the whole reason Jarom is writing. The answer. Stated as a direct promise from God, this is the formula. According to Jarom, Nephite survival, it was all directly tied to their obedience to God's commandments. When they were righteous, they thrived. This one belief became the engine that drove their entire society. And hey, this idea of prosperity wasn't just some vague spiritual feeling. The record describes it in very real, very material terms. We're talking gold and silver, incredible craftsmanship in buildings, advanced machinery and tools, complex metalworking with iron and steel, and, this is a big one, sophisticated weapons of war. In this view, their righteousness literally translated into technological and economic power. But, a formula like this doesn't just run on autopilot, especially when your people have a tendency towards that stiffness of their necks, right? It needed constant maintenance. And that's where the prophets and spiritual leaders stepped in. Yeah, survival was an active, hands-on process. Jarom really makes a point of saying that prophets, priests, and teachers had to labor diligently. They had to work hard to keep everyone on the right path. They were like the guardians of this formula, constantly working to keep the whole society from falling apart. And they had a whole playbook for this. It was a very clear, multi-step strategy. First, they'd hit them with these stark warnings about what would happen if they messed up. But it wasn't all doom and gloom. They also taught the law, got people focused on a future Messiah, and used powerful words to, stir their hearts and bring them back around. And all that brings us right back to Jarom himself. After he's explained this whole cycle over the centuries, it's time for him to wrap up his own small contribution to the record. And remember that problem with the small plates? It forces his hand here. Jarom says flat out, look, there's just not enough room for the full history, especially all the details about our wars. He basically says, if you want that stuff, go look at the other, bigger records. His job was different. It was to preserve the core spiritual lesson of how they survived everything. So, in his final act, Jarom fulfills the command he was given. He passes the plates to his son, Omni. He entrusts him with the exact same mission he got from his own father: keep the records safe, preserve the formula, and make sure the story of their people doesn't die. Which leaves us with this final thought to chew on. The Book of Jarom shows us a history where everything, survival, wealth, identity, it's all wrapped up in a single religious idea. It's an incredibly powerful way to see the world, and it really makes you wonder, what are the strengths and maybe the weaknesses of a society that builds its entire story on one single core belief?